thank you for joining us today on our webinar covering emerging patterns and paradigms in testing. My name is Matt Simons. I'm the Director of Global Delivery for ThoughtWorks, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We're planning about 45 minutes of presentation today, followed by 15 minutes of live Q&A from the audience, which you'll submit via your conference Q&A feature to all panelists. All of your phones are muted. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, feel free to submit them if you're having any trouble or have a response to something that Kristen says. You can launch your questions at any time. We'll kind of queue them up and take as many as possible at the conclusion of the planned remarks. If you are having any trouble with screen sizing, sometimes people have trouble with this, there's a sharing button at the top of your conference window. You can choose View, Auto Fit, or full screen to resize your screen so that it looks right. Right. Our webinar today is brought to you courtesy of ThoughtWorks. ThoughtWorks is a global IT services and product organization. We have an exclusive focus on building excellent software solutions to solve our customers' highest priority business problems. We've been around and independent for about 18 years. We're now in 8 countries, and we have over 20 different offices scattered around the map, as you can see there. We're approaching 2,000 people, roughly split between 50-50 split between large delivery centers in Brazil, India, and China, and then onshore people working in the dots that you can see on the map. Our CEO likes to tell people that we're big enough to trust, but small enough to care. Our independence for that long period of time, combined with that passion for software excellence, it means that we tend to swim against the stream somewhat. We're very proud that some of the most disruptive and transformative ideas in software development in the past 20 years have originated or been nurtured by ThoughtWorks and ThoughtWorkers. And with that, I am pleased to introduce and hand you over to today's speaker, Kristen Vingras. Kristen is joining us today from Melbourne, where I believe it is approximately o'clock in the morning. So thank you, Kristen, for staying up late. And please, everyone, forgive him if his voice is a little croaky in the early stages while it warms up again. Kristen is one of our leading thinkers and practitioners in the testing space. And today he's going to outline some of the emerging paradigms in testing that we believe have the potential to generate a lot of positive change in that space and in our industry. So, Kristen, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So I got into testing in the late 90s when I joined Ericsson as a verification engineer and started testing both software and hardware for telephone exchanges. And since then I've progressed through various companies, joining, like most people, a couple of startups during the .com years as a test analyst and then a test team lead, moving into test management. And throughout my career, I've always stayed in testing. I've never really progressed into other areas. Even when I was doing some product management, I still had my hands and fingers in testing. I've been across a number of industries, from insurance to telecommunications, finance, logistics, media, and e-commerce. So I have seen a range of different testing techniques and a range of different ways that people have approached testing. And from that, I've since working at ThoughtWorks as a global test practice lead, I've also been able to see how testing is being done across the world in a number of different countries. And working with some of my great colleagues at ThoughtWorks, we've come up with a bunch of principles that we think we apply to testing when we take on testing in a given project. So what we like to do is look at the principles versus the practices, understand what it is that people are trying to do, the context within which they're trying to do that, and then from there, apply these principles to determine the best way of approaching testing. So the principles we have, which you can see on your screen, are the ones that are highlighted in bold and underlined. So there's 7 principles that we're going to talk about today. The first one is around building quality in. The next one would be involving everyone, fast feedback, tests are an asset, faster delivery into production, clear and consistent view of testing, and business optimized value, or optimizing business value. So what I wanted to do is to use a case study to help outline and indicate how testing actually was applied in a given program of work and the impact that that had. Then I'm going to talk about a particular principle in more detail, talk about a practice which highlights how that principle may be used or utilised, and then give you an example from the case study to highlight what that principle might have been. So the case study I'm talking about is an insurance company. The insurance company was trying to create a new business unit, and they're wanting to create that business unit with mostly an online presence. They decided to go with multiple vendors, and they were using a mixed approach to development. There's some people doing agile, some people doing waterfall, some people not really following much of an approach. And there was approximately 60 developers all up across a range of about 6 different vendors. The technology had a mainframe backend, there was a services layer, there were multiple front-end systems, and a couple of external third-party systems to do things like printing the documentation and also to manage some of the claims as an insurance company. The testing needed to cover a range of things, from functional testing, also performance, security. The security included PCI compliance, as we're dealing with credit cards. There was a disaster recovery, failover recovery, deploy rollback, user acceptance. So a full range of testing that was going to be conducted. For the 60 developers, we had 5 full-time testers on the team. After 6 months of development, and once the last feature had been finished coded, there was 1 week between go live. And in the first 9 months, and I'll say the first 9 months because since then I'd left that organisation and moved on as part of my role at ThoughtWorks, there were no severity 1 defects. After the initial go live stage, so after the first 6 months, we were able to make code changes and deploy them in the same day. There's no severity 1 or severity 2 defects in the 9 months since we were doing that. So the business were wanting to add new features, make minor changes, we were able to make those code changes and get them into production in the same day because of the testing that had been applied. So if we start looking at the principle, build quality in, and this is the first principle that I wanted to talk about. And I do like this quote from Deming, which is, you cannot inspect quality into the product, it is already there. So the principle is about actually looking at trying to prevent the defect from occurring in the first place. So working in a way where you are focusing on stopping the defect from getting into the product, either into the requirements or into the code, rather than looking at trying to detect the defects after they've gone into the product. The benefits you get here, of course, you remove the cost of fixing the defects. And most of you have probably seen the defect cost curve, where the later you find the defect, the more it costs. Well, if you stop the defect from getting in there in the first place, it reduces the cost of fixing those defects greatly, as you can imagine. You start finding mistakes earlier on, and you stop them becoming prevalent. What I mean by that is, when you get an issue that occurs, it only occurs once, as opposed to that mistake being made over and over again across either the requirements or the code base. And you have less reliance on Band-Aid fixes. So the closer you start getting towards production and towards release, and when you're finding those issues, and some of those can be quite large issues, you can't always fix them the right way. Sometimes you just need to put in a fix that's going to be good enough so that you can ship. And then, of course, you have to deal with that good enough fix later on when you're doing the next release, or you continue on doing the maintenance. So a practice that we use to follow that principle of building quality in is acceptance test-driven development. And what acceptance test-driven development is taking a small testable vertical slice of the application, something you can implement generally in 2 to 3 days, then having the BA or the business representative sitting with the tester and looking at that particular requirement and defining how the feature is going to be tested, and listing out the tests that are going to be run to determine whether that feature is correct or not. Those tests, of course, will initially fail. And the reason they'll fail is because there's been nothing created in the system by the developers or the development team to make the test work. Then the developers will go and create the application to satisfy that particular requirement. And the testers will work with the developers at the same time to implement and flesh out those test cases and start running the test cases. Then the test will pass. And of course, once the test passed, then that's an indication to the developers that what they've done is complete and working. The BA and the tester, or the business representative and the tester, will then get a handover of those features from the developers. It will show them how they're working and how it's been passing. And then they can go off and do what I call higher value testing. Check how the requirement that's just been completed fits into the broader system. Check how that requirement fits into the business processes. And also start looking at things like data corruption or making the system crash or other edge case conditions that may not have been covered by the testing of the requirement in the first place. When it comes to that example project or the case study that I talked about before, the insurance one, there was a situation where we're about 4 months through the initial delivery. We had identified during that 4-month period about 300 defects. So we'd logged about 300 defects in the defect system. And the CIO of the parent company that was sponsoring this initiative called me into his office and wanted to talk to me about the number of defects that we had. As I was going in, I was running through my head about all the things we'd just been working on and initiatives we'd put in place to try and prevent the defect count from increasing. And I sat down and before I said anything, he started to talk to me. And he said to me, with the complexity of this program, with the multiple vendors and all the different technologies being utilised, and we're about 4 months into it, he would have expected that our defect count would have been about 1,000 or 1,500. And because we only had 300 defects, he didn't feel that our testing was sufficient, and I needed to justify the testing we were doing. And it was at that point that I realised that as a tester, my focus had shifted from finding defects to preventing defects. So the next principle I wanted to talk about was fast feedback. You really want to get the feedback to the person who needs it as soon as possible. So as soon as a requirement's being written by the analyst or the business, you want to let them know if that requirement's ambiguous. You want to let them know if that requirement doesn't make sense as to what you're trying to do. And you want to let them know your feedback on that requirement as soon as you can. Same with the developers. When somebody writes some code or writes implements a small feature, the sooner they know whether that's working or not, the better off they are because they can make the changes as required as soon as they've got the information. It's also good to work with up-to-date information. So if the business are trying to decide which way to go, whether to add more features or start fixing up some issues that have come into the software, being able to make that decision with the making an informed decision is really useful. The other thing that I wanted to mention here around fast feedback, because I think everyone would agree that fast feedback is good and should be there, is actually around how long it should take you to run your regression suite. For me, you should be looking at being able to run a regression suite in a matter of hours, not weeks or months. And running that regression suite doesn't necessarily mean automation. So part of it is automation, but there are other techniques and other approaches to testing that can allow you to get that fast feedback using manual testing techniques as well. So one of the practices, or I'll call it a practice, something that we can apply that influence the principle of fast feedback is the test pyramid. I'm not sure how many of you have seen a test pyramid, but the idea of the test pyramid is that you focus a lot more on your unit tests and you have a lot more unit tests, and then you have less integration tests, less acceptance tests, and less scenario tests. Now the reason that this helps with the fast feedback is the unit tests you can run sooner when the code's been created, and they're a lot shorter to run and a lot faster to run. So you get the feedback a lot quicker as to whether what you've done works or not. And then the integration tests, of course, will take a little bit longer, require a little bit more of a system to be able to run, and require a bit more of the other components. And of course, the acceptance and scenario tests will take longer to run and require more components. So if you have a lot more of the unit tests, less integration, less acceptance, less scenario, you will get that feedback a lot faster as a developer while you're creating the system. The next principle is involving everyone. And I've got a little graphic at the top that's saying testing does not equal testers. And what I'm trying to say there is that on any project or any program or any application that's being developed, the testing activities shouldn't just be done by the testers. Everybody on the team should be involved in testing in some way or another. You get a lot better results from the test if you do get a diverse input from all the team members. I think all team members have generally been through application development before, and each of them bring a different history and a different view on where issues can occur and issues that they've seen before in real life. Being able to contribute those and look at those and add those into the testing suites creates you a more richer test suite that allows you to pick up a lot of the problems. The other thing that I think is quite useful if you can get a lot more people involved in testing is it allows the resources to be equalized across the project as things are occurring. So there will be times when the project is focusing more on analysis and less on the testing activities. There will be times where they're focusing more on the development or writing of the code. And then there will be times when the testing activities become a lot more important. And these things, depending upon how you're working, generally come and go over time. So you'll be focusing on testing, then it might be back to analysis, into development, back into testing. By being able to utilize similar resources to do those activities, it allows you to get better use out of those resources over time. Now, a practice that will allow you to get everybody involved in testing, and I'll focus this one in particular around automation. You can see on the screen, hopefully, an automation framework. The idea here is to split the test out so that you split the test intention from the test implementation. The test intention is then written using plain text or straight English. And you can get non-technical people involved in writing those test intentions. So in a lot of cases when we're doing this, the business or business analyst will sit down with the tester and write the test cases and write the test intention using English language. It is then later that somebody who has more of a technical knowledge, whether that's a developer or the tester or the developer and tester working together, can then go and implement those tests. I also think it's important to separate out the test data and the test configuration, as I've shown on this simple automation framework as well. There are a number of advantages by doing this, but the one that really applies back to that principle is that everybody gets involved. Everybody can be involved in creating the automated test suite. Everybody has input into that automated test suite. There are a number of tools that allow you to take this approach. Some of those are tools like Cucumber, Fitness, Accordion, our own tool Twist. They will allow you to do this separation of the test intention from the test implementation. On the particular insurance project that I referred to earlier, we were able to do this separation around the automation that allowed the business to make changes to the rating table and then update a suite of automated tests and run those tests to determine the impact that those rating changes had on the system before they would then make those rating changes go live. And I remember the business representative who was responsible for doing those rating changes and making those changes was able to make the change and get the response in about a week. And he said to me one day that he was so happy at being able to do this, and it was making the business so reactive to change. And where he used to work, to make a rating change and get that into production and get the feedback on whether that rating change was effective or not would normally take him 6 weeks, as opposed to a couple of hours that it was starting to take by implementing this type of automation approach. The next principle I wanted to talk about was test as an asset. And what I mean by that is that the test should be an asset of the product. You should be reusing the test across projects and not creating the test from scratch all the time. There's a lot of situations that I've personally been involved in when I've come onto a project, we're updating an existing application, but there doesn't seem to be an existing test suite, and we need to be creating those tests from scratch. You should have a better understanding of what's covered and what's not covered by the product if you create and store your tests the right way. You should be able to look at a section or an area of the product and understand not only the functional tests that cover that, but all the tests that are covering that particular area. And you should treat the test cases and the application code as one product. Don't separate them out. So there was a project that I was working on, a client where I was working, where the tests were being done in a particular tool, and this was automated tests, and they were stored separately from the code base. The team was working in an iterative approach. And after they finished one particular iteration, the business were quite happy with what they had and would have gone live with that, but decided they wanted to wait 2 more weeks just to get in some bonus features. In that 2-week period of time, the developers had added those extra bonus features. But unfortunately, at the same time, they'd introduced some performance issues, and quite severe performance issues. They spent half a day looking at those and couldn't unpick it easily. And then the decision was made to roll back to the version 2 weeks ago that the business had seen previously and were quite happy with, and go live with that version. The testing team said, well, if you roll back to that version, unfortunately we have to hand-pick all of our automated tests to be in line with that version, and that's going to take us a couple of weeks to do. It was at that time when I realized that it's a lot better to be storing the tests with the code, and when something goes live and the code and the tests all get tagged, everything gets tagged, and it's all one, treated as one, and the tests and the products are all treated the same. The next principle that I wanted to talk about was faster delivery into production. And what I mean by this is that testers should change their approach from looking at how do I stop this going live and what do I need to do to stop this going live, and start thinking, how do I get this into production as quickly as possible with the right level of quality? As a tester myself, and in my earlier days in my career, I know that one of the first things you do when you get a product is try and find something that would prevent it from going live. Try and find those issues that would say, okay, I'm going to stop this going live. And I remember going to a number of go, no-go meetings and going around the room, and in almost all situations, the tester or the test lead or test representative would be the person in that group saying no-go, and most other people would be saying go, and the thing would get pushed live anyway. I think that the tester should really start focusing on how do I get this into production quickly, what are the activities we need to do, and how do I work with the team to ensure that we have the right quality there to get this out, as opposed to taking that gatekeeper type of approach and thinking, what is it that I need to do to stop this from going live? I think people would understand the obvious benefits of getting something into production faster than trying to delay that going into production. One of the practices that I've seen applied that actually works to help things go into production quicker is something called the build pipeline. For those that are also maybe heard some of the new terminology and new techniques being talked about, there's also the continuous delivery approach that I think is appropriate for this particular principle. The screenshot that I'm showing here is showing one of our ThoughtWorks products called Go. So what it's trying to show and it indicates is that there's a pipeline of builds that get deployed into different environments where the automated tests get run to give feedback as to how successful the application has been. You can see here the green bars are showing that that build has passed, and the red bars are showing that that build has then failed. So for any build, if it passes in an early environment, say the development environment, it then moves into the later environment, say the distribution environment, or running some Firefox smoke tests, for example, as shown on this particular graphic. It's important, if you want to be able to pick up your automated tests and run them in different environments, to look at that earlier framework that I was talking about, where you're separating the data and the configuration out in the test cases. This allows you to easily reuse those tests in the later environments. The build pipeline, as you're moving further down the pipeline, the environment should be getting more and more production-like, and therefore you're doing your system integration testing, for example, as part of the build pipeline. The next principle I want to talk about is a clear and consistent view of testing. There was about 6 months ago, I went into a particular client and I was working with the test team, and they had multiple projects they were working on in multiple different business units. And I just asked to see some of the reports that they were producing. And 2 different people came back with the reports, and I looked at the 2 reports, and there's no easy way to compare one project with another. And I think this is common from what I've seen in a number of different organisations, where the reporting that's being done is not clear and it's not consistent across the different projects. So it's very difficult to get an understanding of how testing is actually going across the organisation. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is that metrics should not be driving behaviour. And this I have seen a lot of, and there was one extreme example when I first started at Ericsson around defects. So the testers were being rewarded for the number of defects they found. The developers were actually being rewarded for the number of defects they fixed. And of course there were some rumours that went around where there were developers who were putting defects in, telling the tester where the defect was, then the tester would find it, they'd quickly fix it, and both of those were getting rewarded for doing that behaviour. The last point that I've got on this slide is around being open and honest. So I feel that testing and the reporting of testing should be honest about what it is that's going on with the application. It shouldn't be done in a way to try and make things look like they're not. Here's an example report that I like to use, and it's quite a simple report. But what I've realized when I've been looking at any metric that I use from a testing perspective is I'm normally trying to answer one of these 5 questions by looking at that metric. And the questions are, how busy is testing? What is the testing progress? Now, these 2 can be different. We may not have progressed. We may not have hit a milestone like being able to run some performance tests or being able to do some security testing, but we may still be busy as testers. The risk level of the application. An application may have risks in it if there are areas that haven't been tested. There may be risky areas if they have been tested and there's a number of defects that have been found there. It's generally a good indication that there might be more defects in that area. The quality of the application. So what's the feeling from the testing team about how good this application actually is? And then the last point, which I don't think as testers we do well enough, is what's the quality of our tests themselves? I think a lot of people make the assumption if we have a test suite that includes 600 tests, and we run all 600 of those tests, then we have a good quality of the application. The colours that I use here, the green, the yellow, the red, really is what I like to see as an indication to tell me I should go and talk to somebody. So as a test manager or as somebody who's heading up testing for an organisation or as somebody who's interested in testing for an organisation, if you have a lot of different projects going on, it's good to be able to get this quite simple report from all the projects about how testing is going and see which ones you should go and talk to. So where you have the red, it means I should really go and have a chat to that team to understand better what that red is meaning. You can use metrics to feed into these questions and have the metrics help understand how to answer these questions. But to me, the metrics only help to answer the question. They shouldn't be used as a way of communicating themselves. The next principle is optimizing business value. So I think a lot of people look at testing as just insurance. And what I mean by that is they look at testing as not adding any value into the application itself. The reason you're doing the testing is to ensure that defects are not getting out to the customers or out into your live systems. But I think if you change the approach to testing and change the way that you do and think about testing, you can actually get value from testing back into the product itself. And one of the ways you can do that is by using testing and getting that fast early feedback. It helps drive new features and functionality out of the system. By informing the business of what the system does and doesn't actually do, they can make more informed decisions about how they want to progress. The other thing around the optimizing business value is not to just take what I'll call a scattergun approach to testing. I've been in a number of situations, a number of organizations where they have a regression suite, and they may have 1,200 tests in the regression suite, and for every release, they always run these 1,200 tests. And if you ask them questions about why they're running these tests, a lot of the times the answer is because that's what we always do prior to a release. It's not easy for them to identify what is the business value that this test is trying to cover. What are the things that this test is testing that's important to the business. I also think that another way that you can optimize, help the business get value, is by allowing them to try new ideas in a safe environment. I think there's an expectation from delivery teams that when I get a requirement from business, they already know that that requirement is really what they need. And just like everybody, people make mistakes. And the business sometimes needs to try things out. They think this is what they want, but when they see it, they realize, actually, that's not what I want. So being able to provide that feedback fast and quickly and provide good level of information, it allows the business to try out new ideas in safe environments. Another example that I wanted to refer to on that case study in particular around adding business value through testing was around the marketing message that that company then took out and used to help sell the insurance product that they created. During the testing, we were comparing the speed of how long it took to answer the questions to get a quote and comparing that with the competitors of this particular organization. And we found that the application we created would take less than 60 seconds for a human when they started interacting with the application to when they got the quote back. And all their competitors were taking 2, 3, or 4 minutes. This particular key point was then used as a key messaging and key marketing, that is, get a quote in less than 60 seconds, and was used to help sell the product. And after it had gone live, it was seen that it was that particular message that was resonating the most with the customers and was attracting most of the customers. So that was an indication of how testing identified a particular feature or aspect of the system that then helped drive some more business value. What I also want to say is that it's not just small web applications. So some people might look at what I'm talking about and say, oh yeah, the acceptance test-driven development, I've heard of that. We've used that. You can only use that for small teams or small web apps. You can only use that in certain situations where you're able to utilize certain tools. Here are 3 examples, and there are plenty more examples, but I think these 3 are good examples to give you an indication of where these principles have been applied where it's not just a small web application. So the first one is with a company called Trainline, and you can find a case study on this. It's not just about testing. The case study is more also on the actual development on the ThoughtWorks website. But the train ticketing system was a distributed team. It was between the UK and India. There was approximately 200 people on it. It wasn't just about a web interface, of course, because the train ticketing system also had to print out the tickets themselves. There was another BT Financial Services, which was a financial institution within Australia. Again, it was a distributed team between Australia and India of approximately 100 people. This was a large integration project. There was over 70 systems being integrated together. And the last one was data warehousing. And as you can probably imagine, data warehousing is not traditionally thought of as an area where you can apply some good testing techniques and some of the principles I talked about you might think aren't applicable in data warehousing. Instead, we were able to apply those same techniques and principles. There's approximately 30 different data warehousing solutions that they were trying to combine into one. There were, as you can see here, multiple streams of work with over 150 people working on those different streams and about 5 of those streams running in parallel at any one time. So what I'm just trying to recap here and give you an indication of is these principles that we've talked about, some of the practices we've talked about, don't just apply for small web applications. They apply for a lot of different technologies like data warehouses. You can apply them into mainframes, services, web applications, desktop applications. We've seen these applied in a variety of situations and getting great benefit to the teams who are applying these. So the last thing that I wanted to sort of cover off before we move on to some questions from the audience is really to say it's about the principles. So even though I've gone through the introduction, I've talked about the principles, I've talked about some practices, it's really about the principles. And what I want you to take away, if you take away anything today, is that it's these principles and looking at how I apply these principles in the situation I have, with the technologies I have, with the team I have, with the way that we're working, that's going to allow you to get some improvements. So if I look at something like build quality in, and I think of teams who are working in a very, I'll say, waterfall approach, and they're getting a big BRS document. Now, a lot of these teams will agree that it makes sense to get testers involved early. And I've worked in a situation like this myself. And I get the big BRS document, and I read through the document as a tester, and I come back to give the feedback session, if we have a feedback session, and over 50% of my comments are about spelling and grammar in the document itself. And it doesn't really add a lot of value by doing the spelling and grammar, because we're not there writing a document to get a literary award. Instead, an approach I've taken in that situation and seen being effective is for each major feature or component that's talked about in the BRS, or Business Requirements Specification, to list out 3 or 4 things that I would test. When I look at this, what are the things that I'm thinking as a tester that I think would be important to cover to ensure that that feature is being completed correctly? Then when I go back to the feedback session, I talk about those tests or those areas that I'm thinking. And it starts a discussion. And then people can say, no, actually, you're not understanding what I'm talking about here correctly. Or, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Testing that, really, we need to flesh this particular requirement out. Or, no, what you're talking about there, I've covered that in the later section. And it starts to actually generate a lot of discussion, and discussion that helps build quality into the system because it helps people get a better understanding of what the system is and get a better understanding of how the system's going to be tested. There's something else I want to mention around the build quality in particular. I think it was quite a good story. I was doing a similar presentation. It wasn't a webinar, but I was doing a presentation. And at the end of the presentation, one of the audience members who happened to be a test manager put up their hand and was talking around the acceptance test-driven development approach. And they said to me, if we get the requirement as a tester, we write the test, and we give that to the developers so they know what we're going to test before they write the code, and they write the code to pass the test, isn't that cheating? And I thought, if if we're cheating by making sure that we're writing an application that works, then I'd like to be cheating. So that's it for my presentation. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope I haven't been too croaky in the voice. It is about 3:45 in the morning over here in Australia. If you do want to get some more information about some of the things I talked about, we do have a site called testing.thoughtworks.com where we have a number of articles, and there's also a blog feed from a number of the ThoughtWorks testers who blog regularly that you can go and get some more information about. You can also drop me an email if you have any questions that I don't answer in the next following section. And my email address, which is on the screen, is kvingress@thoughtworks.com. So now I'll open it up to you to ask